This is a very, very strange country. It's the youngest country on earth because it was born in 1993. And it's a piece of Ethiopia that decided to go its own way and become a country for all kinds of historical complicated reasons during the question and answer period maybe, but that would be too long to try to explain. Basically, it's because they were colonized by the Italians, which gave them a completely different destiny from Ethiopia, which was the only country in Africa that was never colonized by anybody. The Italians were there, but for very little time at the beginning of World War II. They occupied Ethiopia less than Germany occupied my country. So that doesn't count as colonization. But what did happen to have a country which today is the African equivalent of North Korea? It's very strange. And it has to do with the extraordinarily long struggle for independence that was fought between 1961 and 1991. 30 years of war by people who had an extraordinary resolve. Because first, the Americans helped the Ethiopians, then there was the Ethiopian Revolution, and then the Soviets helped the Ethiopians. So this guerrilla group managed to hold off an American-backed army and later a Soviet-backed army. And this is quite a record, quite a record. Why is it that something which was seen at a certain period there was a great movement, those of you who are already interested in Africa might remember in the 80s that, Eritrea, the Eritrean mystique of the liberation fighter, they were going to do great things when they would finally get to power, if they did. And when they arrived in power in 1991, they were welcomed by the international community. Their cousins in Ethiopia, because in the meantime the government had changed in Ethiopia, welcomed their independence, so there is none of the problem that we have now with Southern Sudan, which might get stuck halfway towards independence and not get a full one by January of next year. There it was in consultation between Addis Ababa and Asmara that they became independent. Everything seemed fine, and yet now we have one of the hardest and worst dictatorship anywhere on earth. It's a complicated reason, and it goes back to the conditions of the struggle. In 1971, Isayas Afwerki, who is today the president of Eritrea, created with about 15 other men a secret organization which was called the Eritrean People's Revolutionary Party. This was a movement that brought a high degree of centralization to what was largely a regionalized guerrilla movement. In other words, in 1971, when they did that, they had 3, 4, 5 different groups, a little bit, you could say, reminiscent of what we have in Somalia today, that were all fighting the Ethiopians, but they were also fighting each other. And this has remained a very distinctive thing in Isaias's mind. If we do not have complete centralization, complete control of a central organ over the whole movement, we go into anarchy. His obsession is tribal breakdown. And, it's not totally unreasonable when you see a lot of things that have happened in Africa, but he has carried that to an incredible extent to the notion that there should be no autonomy, that the party, the movement, should be in total control of every aspect of what they're doing. And this organization actually was a strange thing because it was inside the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. So you can imagine that as a kind of Russian doll system. You have the outward, which was the one, they had a delegation here in Washington, they had one in London, they had one in Paris, they had one in Rome, they were an international movement, they gathered funds, they had rallies, and all the Eritrean exiles everywhere in the world once a year would have a festival. It was taking place here in Virginia, actually. during those years. And you had a big one in Holland, you had a big one in Rome. And it looked very democratic and open and cheerful and friendly. And then inside you had that little grain that was controlling everything. And people didn't know it till the third Congress of the EPLF in 1994, where Isayas himself said, "This is the real story. This is what happened." And actually, it's quite striking for people, including people who were friends of the EPLF, to realize that during that whole 21-year period, 30-year period actually, this was controlled by a group of 15 people, and you will see that their fate is very interesting because all of them are now either dead or in jail. And Isayas is the only one that is left, and he's the president. And there is an interesting quote that I wanted to give. In 1996, that is 3 years after the referendum of independence, Isayas said in an interview, "We do not want to create another Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Somalia, or Liberia. There will never be in our country any political party based on clan, religion, or tribe." And that is the rationale behind the deadly machine that we now see in power in Eritrea. With, the best of intentions, but that is the result. When the country became independent, at first there was this consensual thing with the former colonial, quote-unquote, master of Ethiopia, and the fact that there was harmony, there was collaboration between Addis Ababa and their former enemy, those rebels who now became a state, which was very strange. I mean, this was a period during which I went several times to Asmara, and it was very striking to see the people who had been fighting each other, seeming to be in very good, there seemed to be no bitterness. And in 1998, the war broke out again. Why? Because Isayas, from his point of view of centralization, realized that the tool he had in hand, that is that small country of 4.5 million people, because that's all what they are, 4.5 million people, was in great danger of economic, how would I say, miscarriage. And he tried to run his former colonial master, because there was the close relationship between the two fronts, the one that had overthrown Mengistu in Ethiopia and the one that had taken power in Asmara. They were co-fighters during the war. They had been together, they had been allies. And the Eritreans were playing the role of the bigger, older brother, and they were economically infiltrating all the structures in Ethiopia, transport, banking, and so on, to the point where the Ethiopians said, "Wait a minute, we were very kind, we let you have your freedom, we're in agreement with your political project, but this is getting too much. This is a case of the tail wagging the dog. We let you free, now you want to run us." And the feeling around, I would say, the end of 97, which was my last visit before the war, you could feel that something was amiss. And by May 98, the Eritrean army crossed the border and attacked Ethiopia. So we're apparently back to square one, but in a completely different situation. It was not the colonial master, it was the colonial victim attacking the former master. And the war lasted for 2 years. It was a very strange war, because it was more like World War I. People digging in trenches and frontal assaults with 10,000 people killed in 2 or 3 days, being mowed down by machine guns. It was Verdun, or the battles of World War I. Very, very strange war. Completely the opposite of what you would think of for former guerrillas. Position warfare with trenches. And the end was a kind of non-peace, non-war, during which, since the cause of the war could not be admitted, Isayas never admitted that he was trying to conquer the former master, there was the Algiers peace agreement, which led to a very uncertain situation. It was not a formal peace that was signed in December 2000 in Algiers. Then things started to change inside Eritrea. That group of 15 which had run everything till then turned around and told Isayas, we cannot go on like this. It's not possible. I mean, our plan has succeeded in the sense we won the war, we're independent, but look what just happened. This new war that we have had between 1998 and 2000 was caused by the fact that with your idea of control, centralization, domination, you have now pitted yourself against reality. We're 4.5 million. The Ethiopians are 84 million. It was completely crazy to try to attack them. And this is due to our system of government because you carried into peace the system we had during the war. Now, it was very good during the war. We won the war. We control everything. Now is the time to relax, to open up and democratize the system. For about 6 months, there was an argument. And then, strangely enough, the consequences, the creation of the dictatorship came because of 9/11. You know, on 9/11, the Americans were strongly disturbed, let's say. They stopped looking at the rest of the world. A week later, Isayas arrested the totality of the political bureau of his own party. On the 18th of September, 2001, he put everybody in the click and said, this is the end of the democratization problem. That was a rather rough measure. Nobody noticed. There was, I mean, obviously the attention was elsewhere. And Isayas calculated perfectly. He did it in 2 days, 18th and 19th of September. And this was the end of any attempt at opening up the system. And this was the beginning of a descent into hell, where we still are, as far as Eritrea is concerned. Because what happened? And let's take the little pieces one by one. You had something which Isayas thought was the key to a proper control of the front, which was called the National Service. All young people were supposed to be military trained for 6 months and then serve the country without pay for 18 months. And they would do things like work on infrastructure and do things of national interest, and after that they would be released. The National Service, and by the way, if you take a cab here in Washington, if you have an Eritrean driver, talk to them about that. You will hear very interesting stories. The National Service became absolutely without limit. All males between the age of 18 and 50 and all females between the ages of 18 and 40 became subject to a new form of national service, which became a kind of open-ended form of slave labor. Because people could, and some of the people who run away, and some of whom you can find here in Virginia, because now you have over 220,000 refugees, Eritrean refugees, for a country of 4.2 million. This is an incredible rate. The people who ran away were people who were in this open-ended form of national slavery. You know, actually this is what people call it, not national service, but national slavery. You could be 3, 4, 5 years. Some people who are still in it today have been in it since 2000, for the past 10 years. People work without pay. And they work without pay for the state. Compared to that, Russian communism was an open and democratic system. People live in military camps, and they work at projects supposedly of national interest. There was a journalist about 2 years ago who asked Isayas, you know, the national service has gotten totally out of control. It's being, you know, going way beyond its initial purpose. And I love the sentence that Isayas used to describe it. He said, this is not slavery. This is very shocking what you're saying. And he said, this is mobilizing people in a low-wage environment. I mean, I love the sentence. You know, a lot of the people who have been mobilized in this low-wage environment are trying to run away. And you know, when you see, for example, the people who get drowned when they are crossing the Mediterranean, crossing from Tunisia to Italy, you know, and you see many, many of them. Usually, if you look at the proportion, you know, you have Kurds, you have Somalis, and so on. But usually 40 to 50% of them are Eritreans. People who have managed to make all their way all the way to Tunisia and who are trying to get into Europe. And for a country which, you know, the African continent has over 500 million people, these guys are 4.5 million. And they make up half of the refugees who are trying to get into Europe. When I'm talking about hell on earth, I'm not exaggerating. And the notion also that they would be working for projects of national interest is getting weaker and weaker. Now you have common stories when you talk with the refugees. I've done a little bit of research into that. I went to Italy because that's where you have the greatest numbers congregated. You will hear young men telling you, I had to work on an officer's farm because he was growing flowers that were exported to Holland. The Dutch are great. They love flowers. They buy them. Some of them do not realize that they are produced by slave labor. You know, the officer told me, you know, this is your national service. You work on my farm. And he said, but, you know, national interest. So the guy gets beaten and he works on the farm. And of course, he runs away if he can. Now, at least 30% of the members of the national service are females. You can guess the type of sexual relationships into which they are forced by army authorities that have control over them. Because the national service is under the control of special courts. These courts were initially created in 1996, before the last war, to repress corruption. You know, the paradox of how institutions can be turned around. And these courts were staffed by army officers, and they were told, you know, you go after people who are corrupt, forget about legality, forget about what is in the law books. But now these people have control over the national service structure. So it has been giving the control of the national service into the hands of people who do not know anything about law and who have been told that they were free to act as they wanted. So, for example, being a young lady in this particular situation is usually not very comfortable. You see a lot of women among these refugees because their situation is even worse than that of the men. Now, people who try to escape have to think twice, because not only do they run the risk of being arrested, but also if they are caught on the border, they're shot. You know, it's exactly like the thing between the two Germanys. The border guards just shoot anybody on sight. But then if the person manages to flee anyway, that person will see that the family will be pursued. And usually, the parents will be arrested and they will be put in jail, and to release themselves they have to pay $3,500, which in Eritrea is an abominable amount. It's I mean, it's something, you know, the average, a good salary in Eritrea is $250 a month. So when you're asked to pay $3,500 for a family because your son ran away, you stay in jail. You just don't have the money. And this connects also with the fact that those who manage to get out still have to pay. And if you talk to Eritreans who are here, all of them are required to pay 2% of their income to the Eritrean state, even when they live here in the United States, even if they are US citizens. How so? If they do not pay, they cannot get, if they, for example, they carry a US passport, they cannot go back to Eritrea. They will not be given a visa. if they still carry an Eritrean passport, this passport will not be renewed. They cannot go into the country. And on top of that, their families will lose their means of subsistence if they do not pay. And I'm not talking about people who are draftees who have managed to escape. I'm talking about ordinary, normal immigrants. For example, young people who manage to get a scholarship abroad and who do not return at the end of their scholarship. If they choose to stay in Europe or in the United States and they do not pay, I was talking recently with people who say, well, my mother has a restaurant, a small restaurant in Asmara. If I do not pay, her license will be withdrawn. She'll starve. So they have the capacity to push the buttons to get money out of the population that is outside, whether or not they want to go back in for a visit, or whether they simply want to avoid their relatives being punished in extremely difficult circumstances. The control is absolutely total. Since this arrest of all the leaders of what is called in Eritrea the G15, the 15 people who are at the core of the political system, there is no free press at all. All the journalists, there was a free press up to 2001. The journalists were all arrested together with the people of the G15, all the 15 leaders who were put in jail. By the way, out of these 15, 6 are already dead. You know, they'll just keep them in jail till they eventually die. Eventually all of them will die. And there are no journalists, and there is absolutely no form of free press whatsoever. So you end up with only a government-run newspaper, which is the exact equivalent of the Pravda of 1952, where all the news are things like today we inaugurated the new milk cooperative, or we built 5 kilometers of roads in that particular place, or the Fruit and Vegetable Association has known great development. Reading that press can put you to sleep in 3 minutes. It's an absolutely amazing thing. It's like a kind of time machine. You're back in China or the Soviet Union of the 1950s. And now, what is done with that wonderful tool that is completely in the hands of Mr. Isayas Afwerki? Rather strange things, because the country economically is basically not very viable. I mean, total amount of exports of Eritrea is $60 million a year. Even for a country of 4 million people, that's not a lot of money. So how do they make money? By selling the one thing they're good at, subversion. It's really a case of a country which has become a heart killer, the whole country. And I'm measuring my words because it seems it's a little bit of an exaggeration. But the first thing that was noticed, because on the 23rd of December of 2009, the United Nations voted sanctions against Eritrea, and then some people began to realize there is something strange in there, because the sanctions were purely voted because of the help that Eritrea was giving to the Shabab movement in Somalia. Now, the Shabab are Muslim extremists. Is Isayas a Muslim extremist? Not at all, not in the least. He's not even a Muslim. He was brought up in the Lutheran Church by Swedish missionaries. And later he became a Marxist and therefore quite an atheist. So you cannot say that he's supporting a Muslim extremist movement because he's himself in sympathy with them. Not in the least. He couldn't care less. But this is a wonderful source of income. So you have to understand that Al-Qaeda and a number of Muslim dawah, I don't know how I could say that, foundations, are in fact ways of making money. And Isayas, who once again not only is not a Muslim but has no Muslim sympathy, even was the victim of Muslim destabilization coming from the Sudan during the early period of the independence in the early 90s, is now closely working with the most radical branches of the Saudi foundations and with Al-Qaeda through a number of halfway houses, including some in Luxembourg, some in the Virgin Islands, purely for cash. So this is a very, very strange situation, because we have the notion that Muslim fundamentalism is somehow linked with the religious and political movement. There it has nothing to do with it. This is cash. But also, there is another thing, the added advantage for the Eritreans. This cash is going to movements in Somalia, and this is particularly annoying for their old Ethiopian enemies. So you're killing two birds with one stone, you're making money, and at the same time you have put a rather unpleasant thing in the back of Mr. Meles Zenawi. But there is much more, and it's really, I remember an old series in US television that was called Have a Gun, Will Travel, and it's literally that. Because one of the strangest episodes of that subversion for cash is the training that Eritrea gave to the Tamil Tigers in 2007 in camps in India. And then, frankly, we're very far from the African, Middle Eastern geopolitical environment, the Tamil Tigers in India. And lo and behold, who paid? Because, you're ready to do subversion for a certain amount of cash. You must find sponsors. And I must say that the sponsor in that case was rather amazing. It was the government of Norway. And I must say that when I first learned that, I couldn't believe it, because the Norwegians have this image of being such democrats, such nice people. If you look at it, there are two socialist parties in Norway. One which is the big social democratic one, like they all have in the Scandinavian countries, and another one which is a little bit of a maverick, which has always been a minority participant in coalition cabinets in Oslo. And that party was involved in negotiations between the government and the Tamil Tigers for a whole number of years. And at some point, a minister of that government decided, let's try something else. And they decided to help the Tamil Tigers militarily by paying the Eritreans. And the Eritreans walked into it. Another thing, Victor Bout, you might have heard about this gentleman who is having a little holiday in Bangkok at present. Victor Bout was one of the great suppliers of these operations for Eritrea. And I spent a good many years in Ethiopia, and I got in fairly friendly terms with a number of Ethiopian Secret Service operatives. And I asked them, what is your estimate of the budget that went into the operations with Bout? And the guy said, we know exactly. We've got our own spies, we've got our own agents there in Massawa. $114 million over the last 5 years. When you see, if you remember that the amount of the exports of that country is $60 million, that gives you an idea of the order of magnitude of the gun running. Because all these were guns that Bout was flying into Massawa, being bought with money from Al-Qaeda or the Islamic foundations, and then reshipped from Massawa to a whole number of beneficiaries. So now we have a state, and of course I will not even mention some of the other aspects, like the fact that they were supplying Hamas. When they got hit by the Israeli Air Force in Sudan, because they had these convoys moving from Massawa to Sudan, and then from there they put them on the back of camels. There is one tribe called the Ababda, who are nomads who live on the border between Sudan and Egypt, and they are smugglers. They have been smugglers for the last 500 years, you know, that's their smugglers, that's their life. And so they took these guns to Hamas, because that was much easier on camels than with the trucks. Well, the Israelis hit the point where the trucks were being unloaded and the guns were being loaded on the camels. They killed about 150 people on Sudanese territory. The Sudanese were shocked because they didn't really, some of them said they didn't know that this was happening. But, okay, that's another local geopolitical thing. Of course, they support a whole variety of subversive organization in Ethiopia. I would say that is almost normal. And so you see that the December 2009 UN sanctions were based only on their role in Somalia, but in fact, if you see the whole array, they could have been based on a whole number of other things. So now we have an extraordinary situation of a government which is a completely centralized dictatorship, which has reduced a large part of its people into slavery, you know, because the national service, what they call the national wale yikalo in Tigrinya, is a form of slavery, of state slavery. I mean, you get $9 a month when you work on the national service, if you get them, because it's not always paid regularly. And this government now is using as a survival method things that are, to say the least, to be very polite, rather contrary to the practice of international law. And nothing happens. You know, it is there. Of course, what can be done? There is no free press, no political parties, no form of political organization whatsoever to challenge that. So it will end up with an assassin's bullet or with war. But Eritrea is a catastrophe waiting to happen. And in that little corner of Africa, people talk a lot about Somalia, which is anarchy. Oh, Eritrea is definitely not anarchy. It is very orderly. And, you know, you can, when you're in Asmara, you can walk at night. There's no danger that you will be robbed. It's extremely well policed.
Thank you very much for everybody for being here.